The clock had just struck 3 a.m. in Berlin, and the city was wrapped in silence. Inside the luxurious Waldorf Astoria hotel, where some of the world's biggest tennis stars were staying ahead of the Berlin Open, everyone appeared to be fast asleep. Then, without warning, a deafening siren shattered the calm. The fire alarm erupted through the hotel corridors, dragging exhausted players from their beds and into a moment of confusion and panic. Among those suddenly awakened were Serena Williams, Coco Gauff, Alex Eala, and Eva Liss, along with hundreds of other guests who were forced to evacuate the building in the middle of the night. Dressed in pajamas and hastily thrown on jackets, they stepped into the chilly Berlin darkness wondering if a real emergency was unfolding. With Wimbledon only days away, the timing could not have been worse. For several tense minutes, uncertainty hung in the air as guests gathered outside beneath flashing emergency lights. Then came the explanation. There was no fire, no smoke, and no danger at all. The entire evacuation had been triggered by a technical malfunction. Relief quickly replaced fear, but the bizarre incident had already created a surreal scene. In that unexpected moment, the sport's biggest stars were no longer champions, celebrities, or global icons. They were simply ordinary people standing together in the cold, tired, confused, and waiting for answers. The image of Alex Eala, Serena Williams, and Coco Gauff gathered under the glow of emergency lights captured a rare glimpse behind the curtain of professional tennis. Were they laughing at the absurdity of the situation, masking frustration, or quietly processing the shock of being pulled from sleep at 3 in the morning? Whatever the answer, it was a scene no one expected to witness. Berlin, Germany, June 17, 2026. The Waldorf Astoria near Berlin Zoo had become a temporary home for tennis royalty. Alex Eala, the 21-year-old Filipino sensation fresh off her Birmingham Open triumph and preparing for her opening round match against Donna Vekic, had finally settled into a deep sleep after an exhausting day of preparation. Down the hall, Coco Gauff was resting ahead of her own campaign, while other stars occupied rooms throughout the hotel, all focused on fine-tuning their games before one of the most important stretches of the season. None of them could have imagined that the biggest disruption to their preparations would come not from an opponent on the court, but from a false alarm in the middle of the night that briefly turned one of Berlin's most luxurious hotels into a scene of confusion, curiosity, and unexpected unity. On another floor, Serena Williams, the 23-time Grand Slam champion, was asleep alongside her daughters, 8-year-old Olympia and 2-year-old Adira, enjoying a rare moment of rest before the demands of the tennis world resumed. Then everything changed in an instant. A piercing siren exploded through the hotel, its relentless shriek cutting through the silence of the night. The fire alarm echoed through the luxury property, bouncing off marble hallways and crystal chandeliers as it jolted guests awake and transformed a peaceful sanctuary into a scene of confusion and urgency. Alex Eala's eyes flew open as she struggled to understand what was happening. Grabbing her phone, she hurried into the hallway, where streams of disoriented guests were already making their way toward the exits. Amid the chaos, she spotted familiar faces, including Coco Gauff, her friend and rival on the WTA Tour, and German rising star Eva Liss. The unusual gathering extended beyond the tennis world, as music superstar Doja Cat, who was in Berlin for a tour stop, was also among those being evacuated. Together, Eala, Gauff, and Liss descended the stairwells and stepped into the chilly Berlin night. Above them, the Waldorf Astoria towered against the darkness while flashing emergency lights painted the scene in shades of red and blue. Moments later, Serena Williams emerged carrying the responsibilities of both a champion and a mother. Olympia, still half asleep, clutched her mother's hand, while little Adira was carried by a member of the Williams entourage, wrapped tightly against the cold. Reflecting on the ordeal afterward, Williams coach Rennie Stubbs captured the absurdity of the situation, noting how difficult it was to wake a 2-year-old child in the middle of the night and bring her outside at 3 o'clock in the morning. Yet amid the disruption and uncertainty, something remarkable happened. Standing beneath the glow of emergency lights, Coco Gauff and Alex Eala shared a moment that transcended rankings, rivalries, and tournament pressure. For a brief time, the stress of professional tennis disappeared, replaced by the shared experience of a surreal and unforgettable night in Berlin. For those few strange moments under the flashing emergency lights, the usual rivalries of professional tennis seemed to disappear. Alex Eala and Coco Gauff were no longer competitors chasing titles and rankings. They were simply two young women standing in the cold, wrapped in pajamas and uncertainty, waiting for answers about what had just disrupted their night. Eva Liss, embracing the surreal nature of the moment, pulled out her phone and captured a photograph that would soon make its way across social media. The image showed Gauff and Eala in their late-night attire with a fire truck parked behind them, while the timestamp revealed the absurd hour, 3:46 a.m. Later, Liss would jokingly caption the post, 3 a.m. fire alarm fit check. Despite the humor, the situation was far from ideal. Guests remained outside for nearly 45 minutes as emergency personnel investigated the cause of the alarm. Some had been awakened just before 4 in the morning and forced to leave their rooms with little warning. Rennie Stubbs, who initially stayed behind after experiencing a similar false alarm the previous week, eventually decided it was safer to evacuate and made the long trek down 8 flights of stairs. Looking back on the scene, she described the unusual gathering with amazement. There stood Serena Williams and her 2 children, surrounded by fellow athletes, hotel guests, and even music superstar Doja Cat, all brought together by a technical malfunction that cared little about fame or status. When officials finally announced that there was no fire and that the alarm had been triggered by a system error, a wave of relief swept through the crowd. Guests were permitted to return to their rooms, but the interruption had already taken its toll. Precious hours of sleep had been lost, nerves had been rattled, and players now faced the challenge of preparing for elite-level competition on minimal rest. For Alex Eala, the timing was especially brutal, as she was scheduled to play the opening match of the day at 11 a.m. against Donna Vekic. Coco Gauff, benefiting from a first-round bye, had slightly more time to recover, but the disruption was frustrating nonetheless. As the hotel slowly returned to silence and the players made their way back upstairs, the reality of the night began to sink in. The alarm may have been false, but the memory of being forced into the cold Berlin darkness in the middle of the night, surrounded by some of the most recognizable figures in sports and entertainment, was a moment none of them would soon forget. Even after guests were allowed back inside, the images from that unforgettable night refused to fade. The sight of Serena Williams carefully caring for her young daughter as she descended multiple flights of stairs, the image of Coco Gauff and Alex Eala standing side by side beneath flashing emergency lights, and the mixture of laughter, anxiety, and confusion that filled the chilly Berlin air would remain etched in memory long after sunrise. The tournament would continue as planned, but everyone involved would carry a piece of that strange night with them. It was now around 3:30 a.m. at Berlin's Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The initial shock had passed, yet many guests remained gathered outside as authorities completed their safety checks. The cold night air swept through the streets while blue and red emergency lights painted the scene in an almost cinematic glow. Some of the world's most recognizable athletes stood quietly on the pavement, no longer defined by trophies, rankings, or global fame, but by a shared experience that had caught them completely off guard. Serena Williams stood protectively near her daughters, who were wrapped tightly in hotel blankets. 8-year-old Olympia held firmly to her mother's hand, fighting off exhaustion, while 2-year-old Adira remained close to the family's entourage, still too sleepy to fully understand what was happening. For Williams, a champion who had conquered the biggest stages in tennis countless times, the challenge that night was not an opponent across the net but comforting her children in the middle of an unexpected evacuation. A short distance away, Coco Gauff and Alex Eala stood together, their breath visible in the cold air. The rivalry, pressure, and competitive intensity that had marked their encounters on tour seemed irrelevant in that moment. The Dubai final, the tense matches, the expectations of fans and media, all of it faded into the background. Under the flashing emergency lights, they were no longer rivals battling for victories and rankings. They were simply two young athletes sharing an unexpected experience, waiting alongside everyone else for answers and hoping the night would finally return to normal. For a brief stretch of time, Coco Gauff and Alex Eala were no longer rivals competing for titles. rankings, and recognition. They were simply two young women standing in the cold Berlin night, wrapped in sleepwear and sharing a bizarre experience neither would soon forget. Eva Liss, always quick to capture memorable moments, pulled out her phone and documented the scene. The photograph showed Gauff and Eala in their late-night outfits with a fire truck visible behind them, while the timestamp revealed the unusual hour, 3:46 a.m. Shortly afterward, Liss posted the image on Instagram with a caption that perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation. 3 a.m. fire alarm fit check. The post quickly gained attention, offering fans a rare glimpse behind the polished image of professional athletes. Meanwhile, Rennie Stubbs, Serena Williams' longtime coach and advisor, had initially remained in her room, having experienced a similar false alarm only a week earlier. But as the sirens continued and the evacuation became unavoidable, she eventually descended 8 flights of stairs and joined the growing crowd gathered outside. Reflecting on the surreal scene later, Stubbs recalled the unusual mix of people standing together in the middle of the night. On one side was Serena Williams, one of the greatest athletes in history. On another stood music superstar Doja Cat. Around them were tennis players, coaches, hotel staff, and guests, all united by an unexpected interruption that cared little about fame or status. The wait stretched on for nearly half an hour as guests huddled together in whatever clothing they had managed to grab before rushing from their rooms. Confused glances gradually gave way to nervous laughter. Under the glow of flashing emergency lights, conversations began to flow. Jokes were exchanged, stories were shared, and a unique sense of camaraderie emerged among people who might never otherwise have spent time together. The relentless pressures of the professional tour, the rankings, expectations, media attention, and fierce competition suddenly seemed distant and unimportant. In that moment, there was only the cold Berlin air, the rhythm of emergency lights reflecting off the pavement, and the shared realization that they were all experiencing something completely unexpected. Then, at 3:49 a.m., another chapter of the night unfolded. The first social media post documenting the evacuation appeared online, transforming a strange hotel incident into a story that would soon capture the attention of tennis fans around the world. At 3:49 a.m., the first glimpse of the night's chaos reached the outside world. Eva Liss, the 24-year-old German star who had recently advanced to the round of 16 at the Berlin Open, pulled out her phone and captured a moment that perfectly summed up the surreal scene unfolding outside the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. The photo showed Coco Gauff and Alex Eala standing in front of a fire truck, illuminated by the flashing blue emergency lights that cast an almost cinematic glow across their faces. Gone were the polished appearances and carefully managed public images seen on television each week. There was no makeup, no preparation, and no attempt to look camera-ready. Just two young athletes standing in pajamas in the middle of an unexpected evacuation. Liss uploaded the image to Instagram with a caption that instantly resonated with fans. 3 a.m. fire alarm fit check. Within minutes, the post began spreading across social media, and within hours it had been viewed by millions around the world. Yet behind the humor, one question dominated the conversation. Was there actually a fire? The answer was surprisingly simple. There had never been any danger. Hotel officials later confirmed that the evacuation had been triggered by a technica malfunction, a faulty alarm system, and nothing more. There was no smoke, no flames, and no emergency beyond the false alert itself. But while the threat was non-existent, the disruption was very real. Valuable sleep had been lost, nerves had been rattled, and some of the world's best tennis players were now preparing for competition after spending part of the night standing outside in the cold. For Alex Eala, the timing was especially difficult, as her first-round match against Donna Vekic was scheduled for 11 a.m., leaving little time to recover. Coco Gauff, who had received a first round by following Amanda Anisimova's withdrawal, faced a less immediate challenge, but the interruption was frustrating nonetheless. Serena Williams, a champion who had navigated pressure-filled Grand Slam finals, hostile crowds, and some of the most intense moments in sports history, encountered a very different test that night. Nothing in her remarkable career could have prepared her for the challenge of waking a 2-year-old child in the middle of the night, carrying her into the cold darkness, and trying to keep her calm while an entire luxury hotel stood waiting for answers. In the end, there was no fire, but the unforgettable images, the sleepless hours, and the strange sense of unity created by the ordeal ensured that this would be one Berlin night no one involved would ever forget. Reflecting on the bizarre ordeal afterward, Rennie Stubbs shared the story on her podcast and described the challenge faced by Serena Williams that night. She recalled how difficult it was to wake a 2-year-old child in the middle of the night and carry her outside at 3 o'clock in the morning while trying to keep her calm and reassured. Stubbs herself had initially remained in her room, having experienced a similar false alarm the previous week in London, but eventually decided to evacuate and made her way down 8 flights of stairs to join the crowd gathering outside the hotel. Looking around, she couldn't help but marvel at the unusual scene. On one side stood Serena Williams with her children, on another stood music superstar Doja Cat, while players, coaches, staff members, and guests all waited together in the cold Berlin night.